reasoning with God. So, as I repeatedly argue that in this process of conversing and engaging is a demonstration for it not to be frivolous, is a demonstration of a moral trajectory. Like all Quranic parables, it is decreed for the purpose of an education and exemplifying the exemplification, if I can invent a word. It's very much like the hypotheticals we use in law school. The hypotheticals are there not because they are the law, but because they are examples of the trajectory of the law, of the direction of the law. So, to be more concrete, more specific, and this is when the Quran talks about what you do with theft. The Quran talks about something that epistemologically was anchored at the time. The Quran doesn't talk about stoning, that comes from the traditions attributed to the Prophet. But even if the Quran had repeated the biblical discourse on stoning, it would have been talking about an epistemological process in which the community partakes in a shaming, a public shaming, and the community, very much like processes of execution, everyone must actually, every soldier must shoot a bullet, that everyone must throw a stone, and then it will become perfectly plausible to say, well, that who is without a sin, go ahead and throw a stone. Epistemologically, it would make perfect sense. It would be a parable. Similarly, when the Quran talks about the inheritance of a sister and says half of what a man inherits, it is an engagement that is contingent upon numerous epistemological factors at the time. It is not the law, it is not the limit of the law, but it is the moral trajectory of the law. In other words, the inheritance of women. In my view, if you study the moral trajectory of the law, we reach a point where we abolish women inheriting half of what a man inherits to full inheritance. Because we understand law as a parable. And laws are often parables. That's the way law teaches, establishes itself, articulates itself, and moves on to the next point. Some say, if someone comes and says, but wait a minute, no, God wanted us to adopt the criminal penalties in the Quran. Cutting the hands of the thief, let's take it as the most famous example. I would say, show me a reasoned argument why God would forever prefer this punishment over all others forever, regardless of epistemological shifts in understanding and sensibilities, as opposed to an argument about a parable and a moral trajectory. I hope I am, because I've left my notes, because I'm not going to make the time, so I hope I'm still being understood. When you write, you're far more eloquent, I believe, than when you speak. Some would say, well, but if God would have wanted, God would have done such and such. This argument about God could have, if God would have wanted, God could have told us not to cut the hands of the thief. It's logically flawed. It argues the non-issue. It argues an issue that was never posed by the circumstances. It's akin to saying, well, have you contemplated that if God would have willed, God could have made us into cockroaches. And so, because of that, let's think about our duties and rights and limits as cockroaches. It's an impossibility. We're not cockroaches. God didn't make us into cockroaches. All right. This argument from moral trajectory avoids a very important issue, and that is what happens with unreasonableness. The epistemological praxis of unreasonableness, when human beings at a certain historical moment receive divine revelation which, per their sensibilities, are shocking, offensive, hurtful, not beautiful, not merciful, not compassionate. There's a friend in London who's done a PhD. He's now working on revising it to publish as a book. It's a wonderful study. He took the technology of lie detectors and brought in, I don't understand statistics, but a statistically sound sample of Muslims, and asked them, do you believe God is merciful? Yes, true. Rings true. Do you believe Sharia is just? Yes, rings as true. Do you believe cutting the hand of a thief is merciful? Yes, false. An overwhelming number of Muslims would register as lying when they say that stoning or flogging or severing the hands of a thief is merciful or kind. This praxis, this problem, leads to the dilemma of unreasonableness. When your psychology is unable to negotiate what you accept convictionally, you either enter into the process of apologetics, meaning stretched explanations in order to convince yourself of what you are emotionally unwilling or unable to accept. Or coercion, the ISIS phenomena, the Taliban phenomena, where you start just saying, well, you don't think it's reasonable, who cares, we're just going to force you to comply, which is fundamentally and essentially inconsistent with the very idea of a merciful, compassionate, loving, just God, as the Quran itself recognizes when it says that if God would have willed, God would have created everyone as a believer. So who are you to coerce people to believe? All Muslims know that Quranic verse, right? Any Muslims here? You all know it. Now, but it is not talking just about Iman in God, but it is talking about the process of epistemological understandings in and integrity of our process of reasoning with God, that it must be a process of integrity and honesty. I will close with what some of my most perceptive and some of the most probative theorists of Sharia have said about the essence of Sharia, and when do you know that you have deviated from the path of Sharia into the path of the ungodly. Ibn al-Khatib, who died in 776 Islamic era, so 14th century, I think 1375, if I'm not mistaken. Ibn al-Khatib argued that those who truly understand Sharia would understand that Sharia is a nourishment. And it is a nourishment of love. The ability to give and receive love, and the ability to comprehend the love of God and from God as the key to the attainment of all virtue in Sharia. Whatever, by interpretation, is found in Sharia, I'm quoting Ibn al-Khatib, puts you in a position where you are no longer in the attainment of this virtue, cannot be from God. Very powerful and enlightening. I'll close with someone who hasn't received sufficient attention, Ahmad al-Ghazali, who is the brother of Hamid al-Ghazali, Hamid al-Ghazali, the famous Muslim theologian and jurist who wrote the Incoherent of the Philosophers. He had a young brother who wrote some amazing texts that mostly have remained unpublished to our day. Ahmad al-Ghazali, again, he lived 12th century, says, there is no doubt that every lover gives a different sign of the beloved. Every recognizer provides a different explanation, and every verifier is a maker of a different allusion to the beloved. This declaration is, O Lord, our expressions are many, but your loveliness is one. Each of us points to that single beauty, and this is the truth of Sharia. And I close with Ahmad al-Ghazali. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a rich, illuminating, and a very thought-provoking presentation. Professor Abou El Fadl has agreed to address some of your comments or questions, so please.
Well, thank you for a terrific, very provocative and very interesting and meaningful lecture. I'll be familiar with some of your thought. I just want to play devil's advocate for a second, if I may. You speak about epistemologies of eras, but there's no such thing as an epistemology of an era. There are epistemologies of communities, but not even that. There are epistemologies of sections of communities, of groups within communities, of the jurists, as well as different segments of the population. The epistemology of those tortured in prison is different from those epistemology of those shopping in big malls in the Emirates. And so the issue here is, since in Islam, jurisdiction is decentralized, as opposed to the United States, for example, where you may have a Supreme Court at different levels of the court, etc. When you have such decentralized epistemology, or such multiple epistemologies, and if we accept your perspective on how Islamic law is to be produced, then you're going to have incredibly divergent interpretations of everything among the jurists. And that will destroy any sense of cohesion among Islamic jurists. And that may be chaotic in areas that rely on that. What do you say?
Well, yes, there are epistemologies there is no epistemology of an era, and that in itself I use as a parable to get my point across. I mean, if we want the haqq and haqiqah, we would get into numerous epistemologies of numerous things. But I also put that as a caveat that I am not fond of deconstructionism for the sake of deconstructionism, because it's so easy to deconstruct and leave a wasteland and then revel in that wasteland. It is so that point in itself is, we always have to be cautious in our intellectual embracement of deconstructionism. Having said that, now, what we are talking about is theology and law. And one of my major issues is that what qualifies as illegitimate articulation of Sharia, or if you will, Islamic law. And not just in usul al-fiqh, but even in the field of kalam, and in my own work, I go to great pains to argue that ultimately, as you said, Sharia is based on deference. In other words, individual deference. If someone comes and says, you know, I take my Sharia from the alcoholic on the corner of the street, the homeless alcoholic on the corner of the street, that's my Sharia, there is nothing I can do about that. You know, the most I can do is to say, well, it's between you and God, you know, let it play out the way, whichever way it plays out. But in articulating and in fact, performing my obligation in my calling, if you will, and trying to articulate a cohesive frame for the law of God, a God that is engaged, a God that in fact decrees a law to people. That bomb doesn't carry much weight for me. I articulate what are the instrumentalities of what would be worthy of a considered representation of the divine will. So in other words, I am making an argument, a persuasive argument, to Muslims that this type of articulation is worthy of deference, while these types of articulations are not worthy of deference. And in that situation, the fact that there is a shared epistemology within the practice of law, I mean, the whole field of the law as language and the linguistics of law, provides, and I didn't get to that part, but even there reception of the wisdom of the elders and channeling that reception and the protocol of respect and deference, but at the same time reasoning with and challenging those elders, doesn't make Islamic law anything anyone says. I mean, one of the big problems that I see is that this chaotic stage in which we think that as long as someone puts on the displays or the affectations of piety, they might be worthy of deference, or as long as someone cites some tradition, and as you know, there is a tradition attributed to the Prophet about everything and in every possible way, is worthy of deference. That really marks the true crumbling of Sharia in the modern moment. To reclaim Sharia, we must first reclaim its moral basis, its moral premises, and convince, and it's a persuasive process, attempt to convince whoever is willing to be convinced that this is a worthy or a persuasive articulation of Sharia as the path to God and from God. And I think that those who are in this business will be far more successful if they are able to convince most reasonable Muslims that the unreasonable is not part of the divine law of God. They will lose a lot of hard heads and not very intelligent people, but I think they will win a lot of very smart, intelligent, and they will reintroduce Sharia in the moral life of their own societies, resolving numerous problems of the type of schizophrenia that exists between culture and modernity, with all its manifestations of post-colonial, of former colonial cultures or present colonial cultures, whatever. I mean, let's start to address the issue of authenticity in tradition. So it's not a complete answer, but we'll have to do for now.
Before we go on, I want to invite you to partake of some of the refreshments. There's a cake there, drinks, so please.
Cake.
Over here, please.
Thank you. I want to press you a little further on this idea of your assumption of God's reasonableness. You know, a great deal of the canonical and mystical literature is dedicated to the notion that God is ineffable. God operates on a plane far beyond human reason or unreason. God's ways are not our ways. For instance, the book of Job comes to mind, which does make its way into the Quran, if I'm not mistaken.
Not fully, yeah, but in
Not
part.
fully, but so this is not to suggest that God's ineffability can be enlisted on behalf of human irrationality and unreason. Of course not. But at the same time, we need to recall that God is never constrained or defined by human epistemology or human constructs. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what makes you so sure that God is in fact reasonable?
Well, a good part of it is what we mean by reasonable. And in reasoning with God, there's a whole chapter on that. But put it this way, and I think you even articulated it in the question itself. If we accept that God's immutability, without constraints, without limits, then in fact we are compelled, in fact we are required to do exactly what you've said we shouldn't do, and that is do a lot of very irrational things. There's not just no two ways about it. We should slaughter our child if that's what we believe is God's message. We would end up doing exactly what ISIS is doing if it is accepted without constraints. Now, because so much of what we read in the text challenges our powers of reason. Now, specifically in the Islamic context, I have a clear separation in saying that God's immutability is an article of faith. God's calling upon us to do good deeds and to do ihsan and acts of goodness, to be the embodiment of husn. Every chapter of Islamic jurisprudence, every book of Islamic jurisprudence starts out with a chapter on the difference between husn and qubh, between beauty and ugliness, and invariably saying that Muslims are called upon to perform acts of beauty instead of acts of ugliness. Well, a purely literalist approach, in my view, would render this entire discourse meaningless. I mean, then whatever is beautiful is whatever we read in a literal sense in the text, and whatever is ugly is whatever the text does not contain. And so by that definition, if the text says cut the hands of a thief, then that by definition has to be beautiful, no ifs, ands, or buts. And what I argue is that this arises from a wrong approach to there are two engagements of God through the text. There are engagements through general moral obligations. Be good, don't lie, honor your parents, honor your contracts, don't cheat, and that is without sababiyya, without context, without contingencies. It's uttered again and again and again in the Quran without any occasion for revelation. But then we have a very different genre in the Quran, and that is these positive laws that always have an occasion for revelation. There is always asbab al-nuzul, there are occasions for revelations. It was always elicited by a set of material manifestations. And my argument is that, as we often do in law, even when we practice qiyas or the analogy, these instrumental laws must be read as parables that affirm the larger laws, the non-contextual laws, the immortal laws, the perennial laws, the laws that are as immutable as God's self. The instrumental laws, the laws that are contingent, that are contextual, cannot be equivalent to the immutable and perennial laws. Even the text itself, in a larger context, even the text itself defies us and tells us that in the Quran that there are two types of revelations the revelations that are perennial and the revelations that are mutashabih. And mutashabih is very fascinating because it is literally means, if I want to be very modern, I would say epistemologically contingent. That's what mutashabih is. Now, of course, the classical mufassirun, the classical interpreters of the Quran, understood it very differently. But if you reread that portion of the Quran that tells you that God speaks in two voices, the immortal and the mutashabih, you clearly come to the conclusion that, well, the immortal and the contingent, the temporal, in fact, mutashabih would fit linguistically quite well with parable, as in parables. And that's, by the way, in conversations I had with Muslims, of course, a lot of Muslims are very resistant to the idea, what do you mean that the ahkam are parables? That's the portion of revelation that they have the hardest time with, because tashabuh is a parable. There is even linguistically a very difficult time to get around it.
So you criticize this verse of Quran about cutting thieves' hands from ethical and rational point of view, which I agree with you. What if we widen the scope of critique by saying that basically the problem is not that approach or the other one. The problem is the basis, the theoretical basis of Sharia, or the conceptual apparatus of Sharia that allows, for example, fuqaha to just issue crazy fatwas, crazy ahkams. So those bases are no longer valid because those bases were designed basically in pre-modern time, that they have different conception of human being and relationship between human being and God and their life. So fiqh is nothing but basically a discipline to tell people how to manage their everyday life. So if people didn't, so in that sense, fuqaha just like lawyers. If there were no dispute, lawyers would not have any job. So jurists, Islamic jurists, are basically the same. So basically, my argument is that then, if you argue for the historicity of Sharia, then we should argue that okay, it's no longer valid, and therefore there is no basically need for Sharia. Everyone knows how to basically approach his God, and this is something between them and God. So why Sharia?
Well, I mean, Sharia is not what fiqh and is not what the fuqaha produce. Sharia are the laws of moral virtue, and whether everyone knows to approach their God or not, it is not what Sharia is about. Sharia is not a judgment about the taqwa, the piety that is in the hearts. That's not what Sharia is about. Sharia is premised on the idea that human beings are better off reasoning through life with God's involvement rather than without God's involvement. If you don't accept that premise, then goodbye. You're a completely different school of thought. Now, if you accept that premise, and you accept that moral obligations, ethical obligations, in fact, are founded not upon a hypothetical social contract, not upon a hypothetical rules of self-restraint in civil society, not upon a state of nature that has necessary laws by and in of itself. If you don't accept any of that, and you accept, which I don't, that in order to have ethical and moral obligations, you need a superior. It's sort of like in Alcoholics Anonymous. One of the things they tell you is you have to accept a superior being in order to heal. Because if you don't accept a superior being, you don't care if you call that God, and this is in nearly all rehabilitation, alcohol and drug programs, is you have to accept something higher than yourself. I find that quite curious and interesting. Similarly, there's a very serious fundamental, not just Islamic, but it's in Christianity, it's in Judaism, between those who believe we do not need a God, or that God is simply in a secularism, in a secular paradigm gone mad, that God is simply a completely personal issue, and a personal issue that this God does not have any common obligations for social units, and those who believe that, no, humanity is lost. As I talked about the problems of alienations and the problem of loss of meaningless, the number of suicides, the number of drug addictions, the number of people who don't know why the heck they were created and ask why they're on the earth, that the solution to all of that is to accept and to, as a matter of belief and conviction, that the source of obligation is God. And there's the obligations, for the most part, are obligations in the case of Islamic law, of two types: the akhlaq, the moral obligations, justice. But what does justice mean? What follows from justice in a particular historical moment? Mercy. What does mercy mean in a particular historical moment? Now, if you want to say everyone can explore what mercy means and what compassion means on themselves, by themselves, sort of a purely libertarian, somewhat paradoxically Republican point of view, I would say we're in trouble. We're in trouble because no one is going to take care of the homeless and the poor, and there will be no institutional format to explore what compassion means, what mercy means, what fraternity means, what these moral, divine, godly, what brings a society closer to godliness as opposed to godlessness. Now, this means that what we call the fuqaha, in our contemporary culture, the fuqaha are, without variance in every country, are usually the most illiterate and ill-educated and unintelligent individuals. No father is proud to marry his daughter to a faqih. And that's why in Muslim societies, all the smart people major in computer science and engineering and become medical doctors. And that's also why, ironically, you find that medical doctors are the de facto fuqaha of so many Muslim societies. People become medical doctors, and just because they're medical doctors, they start articulating what the law of God is. The solution to this is to remember what it took to formulate a faqih in the pre-modern age. In the pre-modern age, in order to train as a faqih, you did not just study the Quran or grammar, but you needed to master mathematics, logic, philosophy, rhetoric. It took, as George Maqdisi has demonstrated in his scholarship, about 30 years of undergraduate education. I mean, if you put the graduate side, about 40 years of systematic education to become a faqih. And that's why they rose to the position of respect that they did in society. It's not because because people saw in them intelligent and useful and credible. As to what makes the modern faqih, the Azhari faqihs, the Ubandi faqihs, yeah, sure. I mean, they are so unintelligent and ill-educated. They don't study rhetoric, they don't study logic, they don't study philosophy, they don't study mathematics, they don't study social sciences, they have no clue about modern sciences. In my view, these are not jurists. In my view, these are a joke. I wouldn't marry my daughter if I had one to faqih either, although I am one. I was just lucky enough to find someone who would marry me as a faqih. Very generous woman, by the way. Took pity on me and said, okay, come, I'll marry you. But in all seriousness, the enterprise is a persuasive enterprise. There is, as I told Mufti of Egypt, Ali Jum'ah, before he got implicated in the massacre, I once brought a text to him and I said, the text basically was by a Maghribi faqih that said, a proper jurist never resorts to the state to enforce his opinions unless his power, except when his powers of persuasion are a failure. And I read it to Ali Jum'ah, who was the Mufti at the time, and he was very upset by that because he didn't like it. He didn't like the fact that, but it is true. And of course, as history showed us, Ali Jum'ah after that became implicated in the fatwa that validated the massacre of all these people in Rabaa. So it's not, and I'm completely opposed to the idea of fiqh, as I argue in Reasoning with God, as fiqh as imposed by the state. Once the state applies the law no longer becomes the law of God. It becomes the law of the state, and that's something else. Anyway.
Okay, Aziza.
I think that this is a comment and not a question. I very much like your point that the unreasonable is probably not what God wanted. There is an interpretation in the Jewish tradition, which is not a majority one, that Abraham actually failed the test when he agreed to sacrifice Isaac, because he should have recognized that that request from God was an unreasonable request. And we know he failed because of the way God talks to him after
Same
that.
in the Islamic tradition is also a minority view, but it's there.
Yeah. So I understand that you're using this point about epistemologies changing over time in order to get to this argument that God would not want the unreasonable. But following up on what Abdul Qadir was saying, I think there are other directions that you can also go with it. I read this as a pro-affirmative action argument, that in fact different social groups within a certain time, within a certain society, do have very different epistemologies. And this is not heading toward chaos. This is not that the bum on the street gets to now divine law. It's that the bum on the street has a certain epistemology that needs to be accounted for by those who are educated enough to produce the law, right? And it leads to affirmative action for me, because that means that the jurists who are producing the law need to somehow represent a range of epistemologies.
This actually, you touched upon something that is very critical in talking about epistemology, and that is demands. I mean, to me, a jurist who is good at avoiding and ignoring social demands fails in his or her duties, in putting him or herself in that serious, it's a very ethically serious position to say, I am going to speak for God. I mean, I wrote an entire book about that, that speaking for God is, something that only the most, it's like the trust that was offered to the heavens and the earth. You better be very, very, very careful, because you tread on very dangerous grounds. And it is, and I talk quite a bit about that, and we have that at the present moment with the LGBT movement, that when you ignore the social reality and the social momentum, and you ignore a coherent expression of consciousness at your present moment, you fail in your duties. It's actually a moral failure, and as a jurist. And if you are a conscientious jurist, you would you would either step down as a jurist and say, I don't speak for God anymore, forget it, I resign, or you would step up to the plate and try to do so to the best of your abilities. But I fundamentally see reason, and I didn't get to that part, as in the parable when God, but it is in the book, when it's a fascinating part of the parable in the Quran. The angels engage God in reasoning. For those Muslims who say, how dare you talk about reasoning with God? How could you entrust? How could you give the trust to human beings? There are creatures capable of doing foul things. They are capable of murder and corrupting the earth. I mean, basically, what are you doing? And God says to the angels, I know what you don't know. But He doesn't leave it there. This is important. That God then, in one of the says, demonstrates to the angels that how God knows what God is doing by teaching Adam the names of things. Now, there is an enormous exegetical exegesis tradition about what does that mean, teaching Adam the names. Is it simply that God taught Adam symbolizing humanity, language? But if so, how does that address the concern about entrusting human beings who are capable of committing so much corruption? Anyway, to make a long story short, I am very much impacted by the group of commentators within the Islamic tradition that said teaching Adam the names means that gave Adam the intellect, the power of reasoning, and that this is reflected in traditions attributed to the Prophet that which were used to considerable degree by Sufis and also the philosophers, that reasoning and prophecy are co-equal conversants. And we see this in Ibn Rushd in his writings, and Ghazali is sort of shrinking a bit away from saying, well, they're co-equals. But fundamentally, that reasoning is that onerous and blessed trust, and that at any time we deny these powers of reasoning and we abandon them, we failed in our trust. And I think that without that, at least the philosophical construct of Sharia crumbles. it fails to make sense the way it was constructed theologically. Now, some brilliant person might emerge and says, you know what, I'm going to reconstruct a new understanding of Sharia that no one has ever thought of. Be my guest. It hasn't happened yet. I'm waiting for it. And if that person comes, I'll follow them, whoever they are, if it's persuasive. But that's the best of my efforts to this point. And who knows what tomorrow will bring.
The last question.